Hello. Wow, awesome space. Haven't been here before, but very glad to be with you all this evening. Despite the bright lights, I can't see you all, which might be a problem because tonight's all about you. I don't want to talk at you. I want to have a conversation with you. Last night we were in Cape Town and just had an awesome evening with people who had a lot of questions about cryptocurrency, about Bitcoin, about this crazy new trust game that we're playing as humanity. And we had an awesome evening, so hoping to repeat some of that tonight and get your conversation into the mix as soon as possible. It's been an interesting year so far, all 2 months of it, in the cryptocurrency space. And really what we're seeing is a new set of rules emerge on the global monetary stage. And one of the analogies I've been using is if you imagine that we're playing a game of chess, and halfway through the game, I started moving my pieces differently, and I decided, for example, that my knight was going to move like a queen, right? That would probably upset you if you were playing chess against me, because your knights would still be moving as knights, and we'd have a very interesting game of chess going on. But if I found somebody else to play with me by this new set of rules, we'd probably have a fairly reasonable game of chess. I haven't actually tried this myself, but let's pretend that we were playing chess and we had decided that we're going to move our knights like queens. We'd probably have a good game so long as both of us were moving in the same patterns by the same rules. And I think that's really what started to happen in the world of cryptocurrency. We've got a group of people who have decided to change the rules for the way that money works in the world. We don't like the way that the rules worked before. We feel that they've let us down some. They were perfectly good in some situations, but for the most part, they haven't adapted very well to the modern world. So we've written a new set of rules. And that upsets the people very much who we've been playing against, because they're still playing by the old rules. But so long as there's a sufficiently large enough group of us who are playing by the new rules, it doesn't really matter. And the only thing that can, make those rules illegitimate is if we all decide together that this isn't a good idea. So I want to talk to you about ideas tonight. This is a space I'm very passionate about. I've been working in it for the last 8 years. It was around May 2010 when a friend of mine, Justin Spratt, he's not here tonight, hey? Spratty's not here, no. He mentioned Bitcoin to me. I'd heard the name somewhere before, but I'd never really looked into it. So it was in 2010, after he mentioned it to me, that I went and did some Googling and found this seminal document from somebody by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto and read it. And I'll be honest, when I first read it, I didn't quite get the significance of what was being suggested. It was an interesting white paper. And of course, the thing that was most interesting about it was the fact that it suggested a solution to something that was a conundrum in computer science, which is that in the digital world, in the online world, we have abundance of information, but we have no scarcity. For example, if I have a picture of a cat on my phone and I send it to Fred on WhatsApp, now there are 2 copies of the same picture of a cat. Fred can send it on to, another friend, and now there are 3 copies, and that person can post it to Facebook, and people can download it, and now there's 50 copies. And so the digital world lends itself very well to abundance, but scarcity isn't something that existed in the digital world until fairly recently. And what the Satoshi Nakamoto white paper suggested was a way that we could create digital scarcity. For the first time ever, I could have a piece of information on the internet, or stored digitally, and I could send it to somebody else, and it would leave my world and enter their world, and there could only ever be one instance of that store of bits. And that's as applicable to cats in the blockchain space, or pictures of cats rather, not actual cats. We'll get onto crypto kitties later maybe. But that was quite a novel idea, and I think that kind of intrigued me, but how it lends itself to money and how it gives us a better narrative about human trust, that didn't fully hit me until about a year later, where the editor of a magazine by the name of Finweek called me. Her name was Colleen Ordeer, not the magazine, the editor. And she said, "Simon, this Bitcoin thing seems to be taking on a life of its own. Will you write a story for us?" And I did. So in February of that year, Bitcoin hit $1. So 1 Bitcoin was worth $1. And a friend of mine who worked at Finweek magazine, Greta Stein, fantastic economist, she's unfortunately passed on since, but she said to me, "This is ridiculous. Like, this is a game that nerds are playing. and there's no way this thing can be worth $1, right? This is a bubble. And when we went to print with the magazine in June that year, Bitcoin had hit $9. So it was $9 for one Bitcoin. So, if economists thought it was ridiculous at $1, they thought it was 9 times more ridiculous at $9. And last year they thought it was about 20,000 times more ridiculous than it was in 2011, because of course we know what happened to the price since then. So suffice to say, I got laughed at a lot, but in 2011 this journey really started, and I started to become fairly obsessed with what was happening in terms of human trust, personal finances. And what I loved most about it was that there was a new conversation that had started to happen in the world. People, for the first time, certainly in my experience, were starting to wonder what money was, where it came from, how it got its value. And we had all been through this 2008 and 2009 subprime crisis. This was before the movie The Great Short came out, and Brad Pitt helped us understand exactly what had happened. But we knew that something was wrong, and people were starting to have a new conversation about money. So I kind of started fixating on the space and getting my hands dirty, designing products that spoke to this new conversation we were having about money. Not necessarily in cryptocurrency. The first company I got involved with was called 227. In 2012, I joined my friend Christo Darfel, who had just founded the company, and we did a personal financial management app. We got acquired by Old Mutual a year later. I left not long after that. Old Mutual might have had something to do with that, maybe not. But I joined a little startup in Stellenbosch. There were 5 guys in a room in Fire ID. And the CEO, Marcus Swanepoel, called me up and said, "Won't you come and help us? We're building a Bitcoin exchange," which was pretty brave at the time. So I joined that team, and we rolled out some apps and a new web front end. It's since rebranded as Luno. So this is one of the longest running cryptocurrency exchanges in the world. So I did that for a little while, and then left to go to London and created a smart credit card product called Curve, which is doing quite well in Europe now. And then around 2016, early 2016, really started to get the feeling that the market was starting to get ready for this cryptocurrency thing. The technology had been ready for a while, but I don't think the market was ready, and decided to stop building products in the old world and really double down on the new world. So I've got 2 companies I run at the moment. The one is Phantom Design, that designs products in the fintech space with an emphasis on cryptocurrency, and then a capital company called Invest, where we manage capital assets in the cryptocurrency space. And that's my life at the moment. And I think it's fairly easy to get distracted by what's happening from a technology perspective. Bitcoin and the blockchain, which we'll get into, is a fairly elegant piece of technology, but really that's not what makes it cool. The reason I'm so captivated by this space is because of the story that's being told with this technology. So the blockchain to me is a little bit like a Ferrari engine. It's an elegant piece of engineering, but pretty fucking useless on its own, right? What it needs is a story. It needs the body of a Ferrari built around it. It needs a brand image. It needs a reason why you want it. I'm not suggesting Ferraris are necessarily cool. In fact, it's probably the worst example I could give from my own perspective, but you get the idea. What really captivates me is the story that's being told about money. Because really it's reframing something that's as old as language, if we talk about our species anthropologically. Language is probably the most important thing human beings ever discovered, because it gave us the ability for the first time to make up stories about things that don't exist. Mythology is really our superpower as human beings. We invented stories about nation states and gods and demons and, jujus living under the ocean and all sorts of things that don't exist but were very useful because they gave us organizing mechanisms for our species. For the first time, we could organize in groups larger than tribes of about 80 people, because if I knew that I was a Roman legion and I had the ideology that went behind that, I didn't have to know who you were as an individual when I encountered you on the battlefield. I just had to know that we were both Roman legions and we could act in accordance to that mythology. So myth is as old as humanity, and it's probably our most powerful tool. And one of the first things we constructed using language and mythology was money. It's a big imaginary game we play, right, that has no rooting in an objective reality, but it helps us to get stuff done. So from the very beginning of us starting to speak to each other, we started to transact with each other. We used beads, which is a very common form of money in sort of the Africa Rift Valley in East Africa. We used seashells. Baboon bones were another form of early money in Africa. And we started using these things as tokens of the trust we had in each other and our tribe. If I wanted to trade with you, you might have heard of the barter system. The barter system is sort of a novel idea, but it was never in widespread use because it has a problem called currency. For example, if I've just been on the beach and I've caught some fish and I want to exchange them for some corn, mealies, and you've just planted your mealies, we've got a problem because the fish is going to go off in 2 days, but the mealies are only going to be ready to harvest in 4 weeks or 4 months or whatever. So I can give you the fish now, but you're going to have to give me an IOU note so I can come back later and get my mealies, right? And so seashells, baboon bones, clay tokens, we use these things to make our trust portable. You could give me this and I could come back in 4 months and go, hey, here's my seashell, you owe me 4 mealies, remember? Or, you know, if I'd gotten eaten by a lion or had my head chopped off, then one of my ancestors could bring the seashell to you and get the mealies in my place. So money is an ancient game that we've been playing as human beings. And the curious thing about it is that we had always played it in a peer-to-peer fashion. So I don't remember why I put the slide in, but it's kind of funny. Anyway, glancing over that one and talking about trust networks. Yes. If you look at the way that we transacted with each other in the early days of money, it was very much one-to-one. You know, you have the mealies, I have the fish, let's swap a seashell. And so long as we trust each other and we make good on our promises, that's fine. And if you failed me in this trust negotiation, I could trust the tribe. I could go, hey guys, Fred promised me some mealies, I gave him some fish, and now I've brought my seashell back to claim my mealies, and he says I can't have them. And then the tribe would kind of drag me and Fred off to a rock somewhere on the beach, and they'd sort out what had happened here, decide who was right, maybe chop off Fred's head if he was wrong, or throw him into a volcano. These are actual things that have been suggested for Fred's fate. But they would help us sort it out, right? Trust was something I had in my fellow human beings and I had in the tribe. And that was fine when we were organizing into tiny groups of 80 to 100 human beings, but it didn't scale very well, right? And as our groups scaled and we moved from tribes to chiefdoms to villages and cities and towns, and we had to scale trust somehow. And the way we did this was we started outsourcing it. Instead of trusting other individuals and trusting the tribe, I would trust an organization that had a relationship with me and had a relationship with Fred. And so we could transact with each other via this third party without having to know each other directly. And while a lot of people in the cryptocurrency space decry the banking system and think that central banks are the root of all evil, and I tend to agree with them to a degree, you know, this was a very useful system. It enabled us to scale human trust. But we sort of lost this ability to transact directly with each other. We created hops in the system, and we created opportunities for middlemen to step in that we would outsource our trust to. And so if you've ever studied information science, you'll be familiar with these topologies. This is a distributed network, which is fairly obvious, where you've got nodes that are transacting or swapping information directly with each other. And that's the same if you're talking about people transacting with money or passing gossip between each other, or using a communication system like the internet. A distributed topology is one in which all of the nodes in an information network are communicating directly with each other. It's a little bit like a perfect circle. It's theoretically possible, but it doesn't actually exist anywhere in reality, as is the centralized network, which is sometimes called the wheel and spoke or star network, where you've got a central authority, and all of the nodes that want to communicate with each other have to work through the central authority. So if we're talking about communications on the internet, an example of a star network would have been perhaps America Online in the early days, right? I could connect to the internet, but I had to do it via America Online if I was using their services. If I wanted to get a message, let's say that was me, it's a striking resemblance, and that was Fred. I mean, it looks exactly like him. And we wanted to communicate with each other, we'd have to communicate via this central structure. And these central loci of control have a lot of power in a star network. Again, that's the other extreme. It's a little bit like a perfect circle as well. It doesn't actually exist anywhere in reality. But most information networks are in the spectrum between these ideas of a star network or a distributed network. They're what we call decentralized. And as it so happens, the more decentralized they are, the better. The easier information flows. And as we've unpacked things like the internet and as we've scaled information networks and human negotiations, we've learned that the closer we get to a distributed topology, the better. Information wants to live in this kind of structure. It decries star networks because it doesn't like having these strong central authorities that can decide when, how, and if we can communicate with each other. And there's a particular nature that information takes on in a distributed network that isn't possible in a star network. William Gibson, the famous sci-fi author, once said that the net interprets censorship as damage and roots around it. And what he meant was that in a distributed network like the internet, if you try and control or stop any node in the network from transferring information, the network will find a route around it. And it'll actually stimulate the addition of nodes to make the network work in spite of these loci of control that are springing up. In a centralized network, I can go and grab this middle ground. I can be a government or an authority, a central bank, for example. I can grab that middle ground and I can control it and I can stop you from communicating with each other. But when I try and do that in a distributed network, the more I try and clutch at power, the less powerful I become, which is quite interesting. And that's something that we're seeing play out on the internet today. We've seen the Chinese government, for example, try to control the flow of communications in their country, and the harder they try, the more they fail. Right? The internet is designed to route around them, to make them less significant, the more they try and gain power in a decentralized network. And the reason I get so excited about cryptocurrency is because the old world of money looks more like this structure, right? It looks more like these star networks where we rely on these central powers to transact with each other. The new world of money looks more like a decentralized network. It looks like the original tribal transaction systems that we had as human beings, where we can transact directly with each other. And when anybody tries to control the way we transact with each other, they become irrelevant to the network. They become outliers, outsiders, and the network starts to ignore them. And that's massively exciting, and we'll perhaps get into the reasons for that. So it's become a bit of an obsession. It's made possible by mathematics. You know, our peer-to-peer transactional networks were not something that scaled. This is the first time that we've been able to scale trust in a peer-to-peer network. You sometimes hear networks like Bitcoin referred to as trustless networks because I don't require those centralized third parties, those loci of trust anymore. I don't have to outsource my trust. I now have a network of consensus, and if I trust the network, I can transact directly with Fred. I can send him some money. It'll go from my account into his account, and there'll be no third-party actor in between. There will be a network that verifies that that transaction has happened via this fantastic new technology called the blockchain. And we now have alternatives to even that. So I think I've done enough talking at you. There are various ways we can take the conversation from here. We can talk about what the blockchain is, and my simplest definition is it's just a way of proving that something has happened on a computer, right? We can talk about mining and masternodes and how the network actually operates and what miners look like in the 21st century. They look like this dude over here, who's German. His name's Marco. He's got jokes for days. So we can talk a little bit about mining if you're curious about how that works. We can talk about Bitcoin wallets and cryptocurrency wallets, what components they have, how you can be your own bank, how you can store something like this on a piece of paper or even in your brain. You don't have to have hardware or software for it. I think one of the misperceptions with cryptocurrency is that it's reliant on the internet. It doesn't have to be. We can have Bitcoin paper money, for example. We can talk about how you encode pieces of information into the Coinbase of cryptocurrency transactions. So this over here is a press release with the information of what happened at Tiananmen Square in China. It's been written into the blockchain as an indelible record, and it's a fascinating story in itself. We can talk about music, and this is a particularly horrible music video for the first song that was ever written into the blockchain by a band in Canada called 22 Hertz. We can talk about how lending and borrowing is evolving and making banks irrelevant in the 21st century, how freelancers can work beyond foreign exchange controls in countries like South Africa. We can talk about decentralized autonomous organizations and ICOs and how 99% of them are trash and are going to lose you your money. We can talk about open markets, distributed markets. We can talk about alternatives to the blockchain, smart contracts, how you would get divorced using blockchain technology. This, by the way, is a contract for divorce on the blockchain. We can talk about attention tokens and the death of advertising, how easy it is to open up cryptocurrency for your own business. But maybe I should spend a few seconds on the price before we do that, because I know that seems to be a fixation. Yeah? Okay, why not? I mean, to be honest, the price of Bitcoin, for example, is probably its least most interesting feature, but sure. So as I mentioned, in 2011, in June, we hit $9 to the Bitcoin. Those of you who own Bitcoin will know that at the end of last year, it rose to this amount, which is $20,000, which is the all-time high Bitcoin has managed to sustain, or just over it. And it was quite interesting seeing the hype at the end of last year. You know, in 2011, 12, 13, even 2014, I would go to family gatherings and people would go, so Simon, you know, how's your job, what you doing? And I'll go, I'm working with some crazy Afrikaans dudes in Stellenbosch building a Bitcoin exchange. And they go, what the fuck is Bitcoin? And it wasn't an easy discussion. And skip forward to the end of 2017, and I'm sure you guys had this experience where I couldn't go to the beach or a restaurant or anywhere without hearing the table next to me, the towel next to me, people all over talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and how they had just bought some at the very cheap price of $20,000. And now they all hate me because if you had suggested that this was a good idea and people lost money in it, then they weren't very happy with you. One of the other things I found interesting was the discussion that it spurred, because most likely I would hear people comparing the price of Bitcoin to the price of stocks, for example. So graphs like this were quite popular. People would say, isn't it amazing? Bitcoin is now at $180 billion, more expensive than PayPal, right, as a market cap. But it's still nowhere near the value of JP Morgan. Alphabet, which is the holding company for Google, is worth, you know, a lot more than all of the Bitcoin in existence. And Apple, at a market cap of 850 or whatever billion dollars, is even more expensive than that. So if we think about Bitcoin as a company, it still seems like there's a lot of room for growth. And this is an interesting discussion, but it's a completely meaningless one, because the competition for Bitcoin is not Apple or JP Morgan or Alphabet or even PayPal. The competition for Bitcoin is the US dollar. We're building an alternative to the US dollar as a world reserve currency, right? This isn't a company. It's not even a precious metal or an asset. This is a currency. So let's compare it to currency, right? Let's think about Bitcoin competing with the US dollar. What would its value be then? And if we look at all of the money that's in existence today, all of the fiat currency anyway, fiat, of course, is a Latin word that means let it be done, or because I say so, right? Which is how money has worked until now. A government has a country, and they have their own currency, and you will use it because they say so. And if you look at all of the money in existence today, that $60 trillion estimate is very conservative. It's closer to $100 trillion of money that exists in the world today. If you compare Bitcoin to that in value, I just made that little orange stripey there for fun. You actually can't see it, right? It's so insignificant on the scale of global monetary supply that it wouldn't show up in a graph like this. It's 0.0 something % of global monetary supply, even at the highest point it's ever reached for a price. So if we think into the future about where the Bitcoin price is going, and we imagine that maybe Bitcoin is remotely successful in what Satoshi Nakamoto intended it to do as digital cash, and maybe just 1% of the world start using this as their main currency, well, then it has to be worth 10 times what it is today at $10,000, right? It would have to be worth $100,000. And that's if it represents 1% of global monetary supply. And that's all I really have to say about price. Yeah, the end. I think it's quite interesting as well because we get into deliberations. I've seen articles with the headline "Digital Gold." There's a book called "Digital Gold." People deliberating about how Bitcoin is a good store of value or it isn't, and everybody kind of arguing about Satoshi Nakamoto's vision and what this thing is supposed to be. When actually the original Bitcoin white paper isn't very ambiguous. It is titled "A Peer-to-Peer Electronic Cash System." Gee, I wonder what he was trying to do, right? Maybe he was designing peer-to-peer electronic cash, right? That is what Bitcoin was designed to be. Not a company, not an alternative to gold or silver or oil. It was designed to be cash. It was designed to be currency. And it sucks as that at the moment, but I believe that that was by design.